Well, congratulations again to Andrea. That's what a terrific honor and well-deserved. My name is Greg Dotson, and I'm on the faculty here at the University of Oregon School of Law. It's always great to be at the Public Interest Environmental Law Conference. It's a place where so many of us get to see old friends and reconnect, get the latest updates, and feel inspired to continue our work. And we're really lucky this weekend because Oregon has decided to share with us a sampler platter of its weather. And I hope everyone has enjoyed that. Makes for a good time. Well, you don't have to be involved in the environmental community too long before you realize the different and distinct roles that are important for resolving environmental conflict and promoting environmental justice. There's an impacted community who organizes and raises their voice to share an injustice. There's the public interest lawyer who interacts with the community and helps navigate the legal paths to justice. There's the government agency whose experience can often play a pivotal role in the outcome. And there's the humble law professor who tries to educate and inspire law students as they set out to tackle these problems. Our keynote speaker today is very familiar with all of these roles. It's my honor to introduce Jeremy Orr, a civil rights and environmental lawyer who grew up on the west side of Detroit. In college, Jeremy became involved in the cleanup of a Superfund site along the Kalamazoo River, and his career in environmental advocacy just took off. Today, Jeremy Orr is the Director of Litigation and Advocacy Partnerships for Earth Justice, where he leads the organization to engage and partner with communities and other stakeholders. Previously, he has worked as a senior attorney for the Natural Resources Defense Council, the Director of State Programs for the People's Climate Movement, the Director of Organizing for Interfaith Worker Justice, an environmental justice attorney for the Transnational Environmental Law Clinic, the Executive Director of the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition, and a lead community organizer with the Gamaliel Foundation. Jeremy has also held government appointments at the state and federal level. He currently serves as the vice chair of the Michigan Environmental Rules Review Committee. He recently completed a 6-year tenure as a member of US EPA's National Environmental Justice Advisory Council. In 2022, he served as the senior fellow in residence at Boston College Law School's Rappaport Center for Law and Public Policy. And in 2023, Jeremy was named to the inaugural cohort of the Obama Foundation Leaders USA program. In addition to all of this, he still finds time to teach environmental law at Michigan State University College of Law. He's a very busy person, or he just can't keep a job. Today's remarks are entitled Navigating the Waters of Justice, the Intersection of Water, Justice, and Democracy. Please join me in welcoming Jeremy Orr.
Sorry, guys, just one moment.
Thank you. And good afternoon. And I'm kind of always hyper aware when I'm at a conference of who stands between me and lunch and who stands between me and the end of the conference. So I would try to do my best to keep it brief so we can wrap up and get you all out of here after having a great weekend. So thank you all for being here today, and thank you to Land, Air, and Water and the coordinators of this year's Public Interest Environmental Law Conference for inviting me to serve as a keynote speaker. With a very special thank you to Nicolette, for one, helping me get this computer set up, but also coordinating my being here. It's truly an honor to be here. To have a keynote speaker like myself, someone who has very publicly spent their career lifting up and addressing issues of environmental injustice, particularly at the intersection of race and class, which often tend to create lots of tension and discomfort, feels pretty significant. And I say it feels, pretty significant because it's very easy to leave the work of justice outside of academic institutions and outside of conferences like this, right? Leave it along with other, tough and uncomfortable topics and issues that we may often want to leave outside of these four walls and institutions. That's the easy thing to do. But as once said by President John F. Kennedy, we choose to do these things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard, because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills, because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win. The work of justice in any form is hard, right? I think I know this, and everyone in this room, knows this as well, especially when we're talking about needing to change laws and policies, which in reality really means we're trying to change the hearts and minds of decision makers, because we're talking about changing longstanding governmental institutions where injustices are systemic and are as longstanding as the institutions themselves. But I think, you all being here this weekend for this conference, particularly with this year's theme of cultivating community, celebrating the achievements of diverse leaders in the environmental movement, in addition to building a foundation for a more inclusive, community-based approach to environmental challenges our world is facing, right? It shows that understanding and having meaningful discourse about the environmental injustices as a challenge that you all are willing to accept and one which you intend to win. And because of that, I consider it a great honor to have been invited here to deliver, one of this year's keynote speeches at the conference. So, thank you again. So, unlike many environmentalists, I didn't grow up with a love and a passion for the environment. And I know that oftentimes sounds weird when I tell it to people and share a bit about my story and how I got involved in this work. But I'll explain a little bit. I didn't grow up with access to the cultivated and natural environmental resources that would make someone like myself want to protect those resources when they grew up, right? As noted in the intro, I grew up in Detroit, in the city, and I still live there in the city, now today. It remains one of the blackest cities in America, with about 80% of residents identifying as Black or African American. I grew up there in the 80s and 90s in a time where we began to see the economic implications of white flight from the city that took place over the course of prior decades. The economic implications ultimately led to Detroit filing for bankruptcy in 2013, becoming the largest American city to ever file for bankruptcy with an estimated debt of $20 billion with the B, $20 billion at the time. But arriving to that bankruptcy, obviously didn't, happen overnight. Played out over the course of decades. And I can vividly remember what it looked like in real time as a child growing up in Detroit. Of course, as a kid, I didn't know exactly what was going on and didn't understand it for what it was. But here's what I knew to be true about that time frame. Right, city services were being cut one after another. Weekly trash pickup became pretty irregular. When it snowed, our street no longer got plowed. And when a street light burned out, it wasn't replaced. And I remember this more than anything because one of the few street lights that were on our block was directly in front of our house. So when it burned out, it would, rarely got replaced in a meaningful time frame, and it'd kind of be pitch black in the surrounding area. But what stands out to me the most is that the two city parks that were in my neighborhood, they stopped being maintained by the city. One park, had a big green open space. It had this huge hill, and at the foot of the hill, there was an open field. And this was an open field where, me and my brothers and neighbors played football as kids. And in the wintertime, we go sledding down this hill. And The other park, which was around the corner as well, had multiple basketball courts, park equipment like swings and monkey bars, and it also had this big open field for sports. But by the time I was around 9 years old, the city divested in those parks as well, right? And they had done this, with other city services throughout the neighborhood, as mentioned. And those parks became, a dilapidated, kind of rodent infested, overgrown nuisance in our community. And it kind of took away my only intentional exposure to outdoor, recreation and outdoor environmental resources. So when I share about kind of my experience as an environmental lawyer, it comes from a lens of protecting human health, right, and people, and is less rooted in my lived experience growing up. But related to recreation, the other thing I remember about living in a place, right, surrounded by water, and not having meaningful access to it was just that, right? I think when many people think of Michigan, right, they think of the Great Lakes and the largest, body of freshwater lakes in the world, and more than that, right, Detroit sits on the banks of the Detroit River, which separates the U.S. from Canada. Yet I can count on one hand how many times as a child I visited the Detroit River. And that's because it wasn't a cultivated space to give the average Detroit resident access to the river. And by that, I mean, when you think of other major cities around the country that have historically cultivated bodies of water as a source of recreation, economic development, wildlife protection, preservation, and just generally a meeting and convening place for people. We didn't have that growing up in the city. And Detroit didn't, kind of create that sort of space until very recently, within the last 5 or 7 years. And being back home in Detroit now and having been back for a little while, it dawned on me, right, that the recent investment also correlates with the return of a fairly white affluent population who are now living downtown next to the river, right? So now we have this amazing riverfront, which was, I think, voted back in 2022 or 2023 the one of the best riverfronts in the country, right? But it isn't lost on me that growing up, this was not something that was cultivated for residents who lived in and around the city, right? But water is more than recreation. You've probably heard this before, and we've been hearing it more and more. Water is life. It is easily the most essential natural resource that we have. And yet, according to the U.S. Water Alliance, more than 2 million people in the U.S. Do not have access to running water in their homes. Nearly 60 million are exposed to contaminated water at the tap in their homes. And an estimated 1 in 20 households have had their water shut off by their local water utility, which estimates to be about 15 million people kind of annually from the most recent survey conducted by Food and Water Watch. So I want to pause right here for a second to explain, my approach to framing water access in the United States. The U.S. is supposed to be a beacon of democracy, right? As you've probably heard over the years. We fight and fund wars, right, abroad, all over the world, in the name of democracy. But every 4 years, including this year, we're told that this is the most important election in the nation's history. Why? Because the future of democracy is on the ballot, right? We hear that every 4 years. But here's the thing about that. Like, you can't sell people on the importance and urgency of protecting and advancing democracy and not expect people to begin to look at societal issues in our country through a lens of whether or not our government actions are upholding those same values and principles of democracy itself, right? It doesn't work that way. So now when I think or write or talk about water and water governance, in the U.S., it's usually from a lens of the intersection of water and democracy. So for me, it's critical to underscore the foundational principle that access to clean water is not only a necessity, but it's a fundamental democratic right, that it embodies the democratic values of equality and human dignity. And by ensuring that everyone, regardless of their background or socioeconomic status, has equal access to essential resources like water, we're not only upholding democratic values, but we're also fostering a society where every individual can thrive. Also, democracy thrives only when there is active participation of its citizens in the decision-making process. In water governance, this translates to meaningful community involvement. By engaging communities in the planning and management of water resources, we advance the principles of inclusivity and empowerment. And we harness the collective wisdom and expertise of the people most directly impacted by the decisions we make around water. And by doing that, we strengthen the democratic fabric of our society and ensure that all voices are heard, included, and respected in the process. And the final thing I'll say on this point of democracy is accountability lives at the heart of democratic governance. Transparency and public oversight are essential to the success of all of our public institutions. And when it comes to the management of water resources, it's equally important that we uphold the highest standards of public accountability in that realm of governance too. And by involving citizens in the oversight of water management for the purpose of prioritizing public welfare, we uphold democratic values and foster trust between government institutions and the communities that they are created to serve. So as I talk today, remember these three democratic principles of equal access, community involvement, and public accountability. By reframing access to water in this way, it becomes clear that addressing water injustice and inequality is not only a matter of environmental and public health concern, but it's also a critical aspect of upholding democratic values in our country. So with that, I think about water in terms of access. Part of that is access in terms of who has it and who doesn't have access to it. But I also look at access from two other lenses, safety and security. And by safety, I mean, if I have literal access to water, running water in my home, is that water actually clean and safe to drink? And by security, I mean, am I secure in that access? Can I afford it? Do I have a limit on my use of that water? How likely am I to lose access to that water at any given moment if I were to face financial hardship? And the reason I think about water in these terms is because I know what it feels like to live in a household without access to water. As mentioned, I grew up in Detroit. I grew up in a two-parent household. Both of my parents worked full-time, and yet there were times throughout my childhood that they were not able to afford, the water bills, right? Because the water bills were so high. And when the water bills got that high, my parents had to choose, right, between which bills they were going to pay. Was it going to be water, right? Was it going to be electric? Was it going to be gas? Or was it going to be the mortgage? And water was almost always the first thing on the chopping block. That was always the default decision to, go without paying the water bill to secure these other necessities. And the reason was because they knew that we could probably make do without water because that's how they knew to make do, and people in our neighborhood knew how to make do without it. My parents kept these big glass jars in the basement pantry full of fresh water, right? So whenever the water was turned off, we'd still have water to bathe and cook and brush our teeth. We knew the normal routine when this would come up. You would go grab enough jars from the basement, you go heat them up on the stove in a pot, right? And you'd use them for whatever you needed them for. But the bottles were these, and there are probably some folks in the room who probably remember, who are old enough to remember this, but the bottles were like from the 70s and 80s. So they were these big glass jars from when apple juice used to come in big glass, like half gallon and gallon jars. So that's what they would use to heat these up. And my parents, kid you not, they still have them. They still live in the same house, same neighborhood, and they still have these glass jars in the bottom of their pantry today. About a year and a half ago, I did an interview, an in-person interview with Brute, the international media outlet, and I was explaining to them in this pre-interview this process, and they couldn't fully wrap their minds around it and conceptualize what I was telling them. So with my mom's permission, I brought them by her house, and we shot the interview in my parents' basement in front of the pantry with all of these dozens of glass water jars from 40 years ago, right? And have been around since. And it really gave an example of what people go through and struggle with as it relates to water security. And I say, all of that to say, right, the fight for clean water is personal to me because I know what it feels like, not to have it and nobody, right? No one should ever have to deal with that, as far as I'm concerned, water is absolutely a human right. However, the laws that are in place ensure to ensure safe access to water, they don't coincide with these sentiments of water being a human right or legally enforceable right. The Safe Drinking Water Act, in which I'll shorten as SIDWA, as I talk about it over these next minute or so. The Safe Drinking Water Act, right, is meant to ensure that water is safe to drink. Right, over 90% of the U.S. Is served by a water system that falls within the purview of SIDWA. Yet, you heard these numbers I mentioned, 5 or so minutes ago, regarding how many people are served by systems that are presently, out of compliance or just simply don't have access to water. So this means, right, that the Safe Drinking Water Act often fails, to protect people. And as you could imagine, this failure disproportionately impacts the most vulnerable communities, particularly, communities of color. All you've had to do over the last 10 years or so is turn on the television, right, to see the magnitude of our water crises that we're facing in the country. We had a Flint water crisis, right, which was followed by a Newark water crisis, which was followed by a Jackson water crisis, which was followed by a Benton Harbor water crisis, one after the other, right? And those are just the ones that we see on TV, right? Those are just the ones that make the national headlines, right? But countless communities across the country face these exact same issues of contaminated water, and simply, they don't make the CNN and they don't make the New York Times, but it's happening everywhere. And the thing that's in common about these aforementioned communities are that they're majority Black, majority low income cities, and that's not by coincidence, right? When you look at the history of these cities and the history of our country, which isn't to say, right, that white communities don't also face issues with water. It's simply saying that the data shows that communities of color, disproportionately face those issues at higher rates, and they're less likely to have these issues remedied. As noted in my intro, prior to joining Earth Justice, I had spent some years at the Natural Resources Defense Council as a senior attorney on our Safe Water Initiative, which was our kind of source to tap drinking water team. And I mainly worked on Safe Drinking Water Act enforcement, including litigation around a number of those crises that I mentioned, just a few seconds ago. And during my time there, we produced this pretty remarkable report named Watered Down Justice. And it looked at the relationship between social, economic, or social demographic characteristics and drinking water violations throughout the country across all 50 states. The report confirmed what we already knew kind of anecdotally, which was that certain communities were experiencing drinking water violations at higher rates than other communities. And those communities were, one, communities of color, low-income communities, areas with non-native English speakers, areas with more people living under crowded housing conditions, and finally, areas with more people that lacked access to transportation. And what I'm going to read here is a direct quote from that report regarding race as the most significant factor in noncompliance. Of all the factors studied, though, race had the strongest relationship to slow and inadequate enforcement of the law. In fact, drinking water systems in places with the highest proportions of their populations that were people of color tended to spend more time out of compliance with the law for more violations for more contaminants. On top of that, even when problems were identified, the enforcement actions were taken, the problems remained uncorrected despite these actions. Communities in which drinking water violations and race intersected were found all over the country, across all 50 states. So, end quote. So that as we produced that report, that paragraph in the summary of the report always kind of stood out to me. And one day I sat down and broke it down, and I'll just break it down here in the 4 kind of subsections of what was said in that paragraph. First, right, to break that up, communities of color, 1, experience drinking water violations at higher rates. 2, they experience more violations for more contaminants, meaning multiple contaminants at the same time, out of compliance and in violation. 3, their water system spent longer periods of time out of compliance. And 4, when problems were identified and government enforcement action was taken, these water systems still did not fix the problem. And that last one always stands out to me, that last point, when you think about that for a second. So even when a regulatory body, takes enforcement action on water quality against a utility, particularly in a community of color, that water utility is basically saying, we hear you, but we still aren't going to fix this problem of serving people poisoned water. And that's like, the only thing I can compare it to is think about being prosecuted for an actual crime. you go to trial, you're found guilty, you're even sentenced, and then at sentencing, you say, Your Honor, like I decided I'm not going to do that jail time, and I'm not going to pay any sort of fines associated with this. But then that's like the judge, in that moment, the judge looks back at you and says, like, man, that's a bold move, and I respect it, and I'm gonna let you not go to jail. I want to see how this plays out. Like that's what we deal with environmental enforcement a lot of times, especially in water, right? We're saying, enforcement action is taken, people are penalized, and yet water utilities and corporate polluters across the board, right, it just becomes a line item, right? The enforcement actions and penalties are often so cheap. It's easier and cheaper to not fix the problem than it is to do it. It's easier to pay the fine. So just kind of, one of the things I think about, right? And that's ridiculous, right? When you think about it, right? But it's the reality of how our country deals with water contamination, right? And that includes lead in drinking water, PFAS in drinking water, PCBs in drinking water, and other toxics in our water. And the other part of the water crisis that we face in our country is rooted in the issue of water insecurity, which is defined as the reliable availability of an acceptable quantity or quality of water for health, livelihoods, and production. The thing about this definition is that it acknowledges there is enough water, but brings into question issues of quality, which we just talked about a second ago, as well as availability and quantity, which is basically about who can afford water, how much can they afford, and is that access to water uninhibited? As you can guess by now, right, my view is that all people should have uninterrupted access to water at all times, regardless of their income or their ability to pay. But once again, this is not the case, throughout our country. And once again, my hometown of Detroit has served as a prime example of water insecurity over the years. The year after Detroit filed for bankruptcy, under emergency management, the city decided that it would generate funds by ramping up enforcement actions on late water bills. That summer, the city initiated the largest residential water shutoff program in U.S. history, shutting off nearly 44,000 homes in a summer, less than a year. 44,000 homes. The ACLU had to step in and file a lawsuit just to even bring attention to this injustice that was going on. And the United Nations actually visited Detroit and declared it a human rights violation as this was going on. And at this time of these shutoffs, Detroit were paying some of the highest water bills in the country, and were under, believe it or not, under a legally enforceable federal court order in which Detroit residents were subsidizing the rates of kind of wealthier white suburbs to have water. Detroiters were covering 83% of the water system's operations, and the suburbs that were piping out water were covering 17%. This was a legally enforceable court order up until maybe about about 25 years ago or so. And even moving beyond Detroit, just up the road, as I kind of mentioned, the Flint water crisis, right? It was revealed at the climax of the water crisis that Flint residents were paying the highest water bills in the country. The average home was paying nearly $900 a year for water. That was double the national average and national cost of water. And they were paying for poisoned water. So they were being charged these rates as the water was poisoned, as they were going through crisis. And there's a common number, right, that we kind of talk about in water, and that your total cost of water annually shouldn't exceed 3% of your household income. And Flint residents at the time were paying, time of the crisis and through the crisis, were paying 7%. So over more than double that kind of exceedance number. And again, right, I lead with these kind of anecdotal stories to make them personal, but the data also backs this up. The NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund did a study on this issue of water security. The report was titled Watercolor, a study of race in the water affordability crisis in America's cities. It was released in 2019, and they just updated the report again in December of 2023, so just a couple of months ago. But this report looked at what it called America's affordability crisis and the impacts it has on low-income families of color, particularly Black communities. And the findings were not different from the aforementioned study on water quality in communities of color, that these communities are disproportionately impacted by the cost of water. one thing to note, as I share the findings, for this report is that the cost of water has doubled over the last 10 years. In some communities, it has actually tripled, especially when you look around urban areas, it's triple. And believe it or not, right, it has risen faster than the cost of gas and groceries. And when you think about the last couple of years, you think about going to buy groceries now, right, or the cost of gas, especially peak pandemic, right, the cost of water still outpaced that. But with that, this report had, 6 findings. The first, that there was a clear connection between historic racial segregation and housing and access to water. Second, Black families were more likely to lose their homes and suffer from health risks related to lack of water. Third, service disconnections were rampant in these communities, i.e., were having their water shut off at higher rates. Fourth, Black communities were more likely to have a water lien placed on their property when they were late paying their bill, which then is assessed on your property tax. And as a result, tax foreclosure on your home is much higher in these communities, rooted in your late water bill not being attached to a tax bill that, if you think about that, if I can't afford my water bill, there's a high chance I'm going to struggle paying my property taxes too. And this can result in many places in a tax foreclosure of city or the county repossessing your home. Also in these communities, they're more likely to lose family. In many states, the lack of running water in a home is a factor in determining if a parent is fit to retain possession of their child, and becomes an issue, right, of keeping families together. And lastly, the criminalization was a factor that was pretty high in Black communities based on this report. In many places, it's a crime to turn your water back on if your utility has shut it off. In some states, it's actually a felony. In other states, it's a misdemeanor, right? But we're talking about all these factors that preceded that last statement, right? You're talking about losing your family, losing your home. And after all of that, right, if you're telling me I don't have running water and I go to turn it back on so that I can avoid all these other consequences, I'll become a part of the criminal system, right? So, right, and I'll say, you may have heard this before, right? But I guess, expensive to be poor. And lately, the criminalization of the poor in communities across the country, it just makes it harder for people to survive everywhere. And as I wrap this up, I want to touch on 2 things briefly, and I say briefly because I imagine if we have time, there would be some questions that I'll be happy to elaborate on. But I want to touch on why we're facing this problem and just some basic solutions. And I'm going to oversimplify these for the sake of time. First, right, why are we facing this problem? Failing infrastructure is the biggest reason as we think about water infrastructure. The United States grade for infrastructure is a C-, right, by the American Society of Civil Engineers. For what it's worth, that is up from a D- from the last report that they did, right? So slowly trending in the right direction, but I mean a C- for our infrastructure, because we're talking about infrastructure that was installed 100 years ago that maybe had a 50-year shelf life and is 50, 60, 70 years beyond the point it should have been removed. The other is just rising water rates, of course, as I touched on. Another is the privatization of water, which we've seen lead to higher rates and higher costs of water. And lastly, water pricing, right? If you look at the markets, right, and look at how water was priced over the years, water, utilities will say that they were underpricing water for too long, and now they're making up for it by overpricing water and passing that cost on to us as ratepayers. But lastly, just here are some solutions. I think stronger, more protective rules at the federal and state level will be helpful instead of leading it to water utilities to kind of govern themselves and make decisions. I think transparency and required reporting on certain consumer measures and consumer protection measures are really important. And then lastly, rate reform and cost reform, which we've been seeing pop up more around the country. I've seen a number of states initiate studies, right, local and statewide studies on the cost of water, which we've seen has led to a lot more assistance and affordability programs, right? But we still need kind of a full stop reform of how we charge for water and what people pay, particularly as it relates to low income communities. So in conclusion, I'll say this: over time, water has become a commodity to be bought and sold for profit. It shouldn't be, at least not in the way that it has been in America. We've been paying for water for so long. Like, it's easy to forget that water is a natural resource in abundance that's necessary to sustain life, and it's not like a commodity, right, to be bought and sold as a luxury. And with that, it should be available and accessible in its cleanest form for all people. And the way to secure that is through the democratization of water. By that, we're talking equal access, community involvement, and public accountability are not just, abstract concept, but guiding principles that should inform our approach to water governance. And by committing to these principles, we not only ensure the sustainable management of our most precious resource, but also reaffirm our commitment to building a more just, equitable, and democratic society for generations to come. So with that, thank you again for having me.